Cordite smells like burnt bleach and bad decisions. It coated the back of Sophia's throat as she watched her team, 6 seasoned operators, get pinned down in a suffocating rocky gorge. They thought she was just another assaulter. They didn't know she was about to save their miserable lives. Heat didn't just radiate off the jagged valley walls. It pressed down like a physical weight, thick with the scent of pulverized limestone and stale sweat. The ambush had started 3 minutes ago, initiated by the deafening, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a PKM heavy machine gun that chewed through the boulder hiding Chief Deshaun Murray. Chips of rock exploded outward. One sharp fragment clipped Sophia's cheek. She didn't feel the cut, only the sudden, warm trickle of moisture racing down her jawline to pool in the scratchy collar of her combat shirt. She pressed her spine harder against the shallow depression of the dried riverbed. Her chest heaved, pulling in air that tasted of copper and exhaust. Beside her, Towns Romero was trying to pack a dressing into a neat, clean hole in his left thigh. His hands, usually steady enough to thread a needle in the dark, were trembling violently. He was muttering something under his breath, a steady stream of profanity that blended with the chaotic pop and crack of enemy AK-47 fire echoing off the canyon walls. "Suppressive fire! Give me something! God damn it!" Murray roared over the radio. His voice, typically a calm, gravelly baritone, was stretched thin by panic. They were Delta Platoon, and they were dying. Sophia wiped a mixture of sweat and grit from her eyelashes. The squad had operated together for 8 months, but she was the new attachment, Liga. The brass had integrated her quietly. A female operator slipped into a Tier 1 unit with minimal fanfare. The men hadn't outright rejected her. They were too professional for overt sabotage, but there was a distinct, icy perimeter drawn around her. They checked her gear twice. They gave her the heaviest radio packs. They assumed she was an assaulter who had squeaked through the pipeline on a political technicality. Murray hadn't bothered to read her full jacket. If he had, he would have known the heavy, olive-drab Eberlestock pack, currently cutting into Sophia's shoulders, didn't hold extra batteries or medical fluids. "I can't get an angle, Chief," Collins shouted from 30 yards ahead. He was pinned behind the burned-out husk of a Hilux, his M4 raised blindly over the hood, firing 3-round bursts into the general direction of the ridgeline. "They've got the high ground. 3, maybe 4 shooters, plus the gunner." Sophia swallowed the sour taste of bile rising in her throat. The tactical reality was a simple, brutal equation. The enemy was elevated at a 30-degree angle, entrenched in a network of shallow caves. The SEALs were trapped in a funnel. In less than 5 minutes, the enemy would maneuver to the flanks and pour plunging fire directly into their open cover. Move. The thought wasn't born of heroism. It was a cold, biological imperative. If she stayed in this depression, she was going to die next to a bleeding heavy weapons specialist and a chief who was rapidly running out of ideas. She turned her head, assessing the topography. To her left, the gorge wall was slightly less vertical, a treacherous slope of loose scree and razor-sharp shale that culminated in a narrow shelf about 50 yards up. It was dangerously exposed. Climbing it would feel like trying to run up a down escalator made of broken glass, all while under fire. "Romero," she hissed, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, trying to sound authoritative, but it came out as a desperate rasp. "Keep pressure on that. Do not let up." Romero just squeezed his eyes shut and pushed down on the gauze. Sophia unclipped her M4 carbine from her sling, laying it gently in the dirt. It was useless for what she needed to do. She reached over her shoulder and unbuckled the primary retention straps of her pack. "Brown, what the hell are you doing?" Murray's voice barked through her earpiece. "Hold your goddamn position." She reached up and clicked her comms off. The sudden silence in her right ear was jarring, leaving only the deafening roar of the firefight. She couldn't afford Murray's panic in her head. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sophia broke cover. Her legs felt like lead, the lactic acid instantly building as she sprinted the 15 yards to the base of the slope. A line of bullets stitched the dirt inches behind her heels, kicking up angry puffs of soil. She threw herself at the incline, her gloved hands clawing at the loose rock. The climb was an agonizing blur of physical failure and mechanical persistence. Her right boot slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles down the slope and slamming her knee into a jagged rock. Pain flared hot and bright, but she bit down on her lip so hard she tasted fresh blood. She didn't look down, she didn't look at the enemy. She just watched the gray stone inches from her face, her fingers finding microscopic holds, her nails breaking inside her Kevlar-lined gloves. The weight of the rifle on her back threatened to pull her backward into the void with every upward lunge. Her lungs screamed, demanding more oxygen than the thin mountain air could provide. Just 10 more feet. She dragged herself over the lip of the stone shelf, collapsing onto her stomach. For a terrifying, pathetic moment, she just lay there, her cheek pressed against the baking rock, wanting nothing more than to close her eyes and sleep. Her entire body shook with adrenaline-induced tremors. Her heart was hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. A burst of machine gun fire shattered the rocks near Murray's position below, snapping her back to reality. Sophia rolled onto her side. Her fingers were clumsy, numb with exhaustion, as she fumbled with the heavy zippers of the drag bag. She yanked the canvas apart, revealing the matte black, suppressed MK-22 advanced sniper rifle. It wasn't a pretty weapon. It was scarred, the paint worn away at the edges from months of dragging it across unforgiving terrain. But as her hands gripped the cold, familiar chassis, the tremors began to subside. This was the only thing that made sense. Not the politics of her deployment, not the sideways glances in the mess hall, just the math. Gravity, wind, distance, and velocity. She snapped the bipod legs down with a sharp double click. She crawled forward, pushing the muzzle through a small V-shaped notch between two boulders, keeping the barrel entirely in the shadows to prevent a glint. She settled the buttstock firmly into the pocket of her shoulder. She pressed her eye to the Schmidt and Bender scope. The world narrowed to a crisp, magnified circle of violence. The optic cut through the heat mirage, bringing the enemy positions into horrifyingly sharp relief. Through the glass, the PKM gunner wasn't just a vague threat on a ridgeline. He was a young man with a patchy beard, wearing a filthy green track jacket, his face contorted in a scream as he held down the trigger. The brass casings were ejecting in a blurry golden stream from his weapon. He was approximately 620 yards out, elevated angle, roughly 12 degrees. Wind was blowing left to right, maybe 4 miles per hour, judging by the dust drifting off the impacts below. Sophia's thumb found the elevation turret. 3 clicks. She adjusted her parallax. The image sharpened until she could see the frayed threads on the gunner's collar. Her breathing was still too fast. Her chest rose and fell, pushing the crosshairs off the target in an erratic, bouncing dance. She closed her eyes for a split second. Inhale, hold, exhale, bottom of the breath. She opened her eyes. The crosshairs floated precisely over the center of the green track jacket. She didn't yank the trigger. She didn't feel a surge of righteous fury. She just applied 3 pounds of steady backward pressure. The rifle bucked, a heavy, solid punch to her collarbone. The suppressor swallowed the violent crack of the 338 Norma Magnum round, reducing it to a hollow, metallic whump that was instantly lost in the canyon's echoes. Through the scope, the result was instantaneous and lacking any cinematic grace. The gunner didn't fly backward, he simply switched off. His head snapped forward as the heavy projectile destroyed his central nervous system, and he collapsed over the receiver of his machine gun, a dead weight instantly silencing the devastating suppressive fire. Down in the gorge, the sudden absence of the PKM's roar was deafening. Sophia didn't pause to watch him bleed. The bolt flew back with a sharp, metallic clack, ejecting a smoking brass casing that bounced off the rock beside her head, smelling sharply of ammonia and burnt carbon. She drove the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round into the chamber. Target 1 down. Time 0. Confusion rippled through the enemy line. They hadn't heard the shot, they didn't know where it came from. The 3 other shooters in the cave network stopped firing at the pinned seals, poking their heads up, looking wildly around the canyon. Sophia tracked her optic to the right, finding a spotter who was frantically waving a radio 580 yards. She didn't adjust the turrets this time. She used the reticle, holding over just slightly for the wind. Her heart rate was stabilizing, dropping into the cold, detached rhythm she had spent years cultivating. Exhale. Rump. The spotter spun like a broken top, the radio shattering in his hand as the round punched through his ribs. He crumpled out of sight behind a limestone pillar. Target 2 down. Time 0:45. Down in the riverbed, Murray was yelling over the net. Sophia had her comms off, but she could imagine the chaos. They were probably looking for CAS, close air support that didn't exist. They hadn't realized yet that their salvation was currently lying in the dirt 50 yards above them, calculating bullet drop. A third enemy combatant, realizing the danger was coming from across the gorge, swung his AK-47 towards Sophia's general direction. He couldn't see her, she was perfectly shadowed, but he saw the dust kicked up by her muzzle blast. He started firing wild, inaccurate bursts that slapped into the rock face 20 feet below her position. Sophia felt a bead of sweat drip into her left eye. It stung terribly, blurring her vision. She forced herself to keep her eye open, blinking rapidly against the salt. Her hand cramped slightly around the pistol grip. She wasn't a machine. Her muscles ached, her knee throbbed from the climb, and she felt a desperate urge to pee. She forced the discomfort into a mental lockbox. She centered the crosshairs on the third shooter. He was moving, scrambling sideways behind a low rock wall. Moving target. Lead him by a foot. She tracked him, matching his pace with the smooth sweep of her rifle. When he paused to reload, exposing his chest for a fraction of a second, she sent the third round. The impact threw him backward into the dark mouth of the cave. Target 3 down. Time 1:20. Her hands were moving on autopilot now. Cycle the bolt. Breathe. Acquire. Suddenly, a massive chunk of rock exploded a foot from her head, showering her neck with razor-sharp splinters. A dedicated enemy sniper had found her. The high-pitched crack of an SVD Dragunov echoed across the gorge a second later. Sophia instinctively flinched, tucking her head behind her scope. Her breathing spiked again, panic clawing at the edges of her focus. He had her zeroed. If she stayed in this exact spot, the next round would go through her optic and into her brain. She couldn't retreat. She dragged the heavy rifle backward, scraping her elbows raw against the stone, and shimmied 5 feet to the right, finding a new, slightly narrower gap in the rocks. She pushed the barrel out, just as another 7.62 round smashed into her previous position. She scanned the opposing ridgeline frantically. Her eye twitched. Where was he? There. A faint puff of dust from a shadowed crevice near the top of the cave network. He was deeply recessed, almost invisible. She could only see the dark circular void of his scope and the faint outline of his shoulder. It was a nightmare shot, nearly 700 yards, upward angle, shooting into deep shadow with only a 6-inch target area exposed. Sophia's finger rested lightly on the trigger. She licked her cracked lips. She didn't feel confident. She felt terrified. If she missed, he wouldn't. She dialed the elevation turret purely by feel, her eyes never leaving the glass. 4 clicks up. She waited. She needed him to commit. Through the optic, she saw the dark circle of his scope shift slightly. He was scanning, looking for her. "Don't move," she whispered aloud, her voice sounding raspy and foreign to her own ears. She settled her crosshairs a hair above his optic. Bottom of the breath. She pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her. She immediately fought the rifle back down to reacquire the target, fully expecting to see the muzzle flash of his return fire. Instead, the dark circle of his scope was gone. In its place, a dark spray of fluid stained the gray rock behind the crevice. The Dragunov's barrel tipped forward, sliding out of the shadows and clattering uselessly down the cliff face. Sophia let out a long, ragged breath, resting her forehead against the back of her scope. She was shivering, despite the oppressive heat. Her stomach churned violently, and she dry-heaved once, a sour burn of acid in her throat, before forcing her eye back to the glass. 4 down. Down in the riverbed, the radio silence from the enemy finally registered with the SEALs. Sophia reached up with a trembling hand and clicked her earpiece back on. "Repeat, who the hell is firing?" Murray's voice demanded, no longer panicked, but laced with profound confusion. "Collins, is that you?" "Negative, Chief," Collins panted over the net. "I haven't fired a shot in 2 minutes. The PKM is down. I think half of them are down." Sophia cleared her throat. She pressed the push-to-talk button on her chest rig. "Chief," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any triumph or bravado. "This is Brown. I have the high ground. Shift your element left. I'm covering your movement." There was a long, static-filled pause on the radio. "Brown?" Murray finally replied, his voice heavy with disbelief. "What are you shooting with?" Sophia racked the bolt, chambering her 5th round. The brass cascaded into the dirt. "Math, Chief," she whispered, her eye locking onto a 5th figure scrambling frantically from the caves. "Just move." Target 5 acquired. Time 4:15. Gravel crunched under the 5th target's boots, an auditory illusion created by her brain filling in the blanks of what her eyes saw through the Schmidt and Bender glass. He was sprinting from the lower cave entrance, desperate to reach a cluster of boulders closer to the pinned seals. Sophia tracked his movement, her reticle bouncing slightly ahead of his center of mass. She didn't consciously calculate the lead time. Her brain executed the geometry in the background, a byproduct of 10,000 hours on flat ranges in the Carolina heat. Whump! Kinetic energy met biology. The running man's legs simply stopped working. His momentum carried his upper body forward, slamming him face first into the unforgiving shale. A cloud of fine, gray dirt plumed into the air around him. He didn't twitch. Target 5 down. Time 5-2. Down in the riverbed, Murray finally recognized the window of opportunity. Over the radio, his voice was tight, stripped of its earlier panic, and replaced by the cold, mechanical cadence of a unit commander. He ordered Collins to lay a base of fire, laying down a thin curtain of 5.56 mm rounds while he grabbed the drag strap on Romero's tactical vest. They began to crawl, a grotesque, three-legged insect dragging itself across the baked earth toward a deeper overhang. Target 6 and Target 7 emerged simultaneously. They were brothers, maybe just friends, but their coordinated pop-up from a trench line 60 yards above the seals showed a terrifying level of training. They leveled their rifles down into the gorge. Sweat pooled in the cup of Sophia's right eye. It stung, blinding her momentarily. She blinked it away, her left hand reaching forward to tweak the parallax adjustment. Her shoulder radiated a deep, throbbing ache, the tissue heavily bruised by the repeated concussive punches of the 338 Norma Magnum. She centered on the man on the left. Whump. The brass ejected, hot and smoking, bouncing off her forearm and leaving a blister she wouldn't notice until tomorrow. The man on the left collapsed, dropping his rifle. The man on the right flinched, turning his head toward his fallen comrade instead of the seals below. It was a fatal, human error. He prioritized his friend over his objective. Sophia felt no pity. Pity was a luxury for people who weren't currently bleeding in a canyon. She drove the bolt forward. Whump. The second man slumped backward into the trench, disappearing from view entirely. Target 7 down. Time 9:30. By the 10th minute, the physical toll of the sniper hide was becoming unbearable. The ambient temperature was hovering around 110 degrees. The matte black barrel of the Mark 22 was radiating a violent heat mirage, a shimmering wave of distorted air rising directly in front of her optic. It made the targets look like they were swimming underwater. She had to shift her head a fraction of an inch to look through the clearer air beside the suppressor's heat plume. Target 8 brought an RPG. He stepped out from behind a jagged spire of limestone, resting the olive drab tube on his shoulder. He was aiming directly at the narrow gap Murray and Romero were currently crossing. Sophia's heart skipped a physical beat. This wasn't a suppression threat. This was an immediate wipeout. If he pulled that trigger, the overpressure alone in that confined space would liquefy Romero's internal organs. She didn't have time to properly steady her breathing. She yanked the crosshairs over his torso. He was angled awkwardly, exposing mostly his side and the back of his tactical vest. She pulled the trigger. The round took him in the lower spine. Real combat rarely yields Hollywood explosions. The RPG warhead didn't detonate in a massive fireball. The gunner simply shrieked a high, thin sound that managed to carry across the gorge and drop the launcher. It clattered harmlessly down the rock face, the firing pin unengaged. The gunner writhed on the ledge for exactly 4 seconds before slipping over the edge himself. Target 8 down. Time 12:15. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, her lungs burning. The smell of hot carbon, vaporized copper, and her own acrid sweat was trapped in the narrow rock crevice. Her fingers were cramped into rigid claws around the pistol grip and the bolt handle. She desperately needed water. Her tongue felt like dry felt against the roof of her mouth. Movement left. Collins barked over the net, his voice raspy. "I'm dry. Reloading." Sophia forced her cramping eye back into the optic. The canyon was growing quiet. The deafening roar of the ambush had been reduced to the sporadic, confused shouting of the surviving enemy fighters. They were terrified. An invisible scythe was cutting them down, and they couldn't find the Reaper. 14 minutes had passed since she broke cover. Her magazine was empty. She rolled slightly onto her side, ignoring the sharp rock digging into her ribs, and fumbled with her tactical belt. Her fingers were numb, clumsily working the plastic retention clip of her spare magazine. She yanked the empty steel box from the rifle's magwell and slammed the fresh one home. 5 rounds left. Target 9 was a suicide run. A fighter in a black tunic broke from the upper caves, abandoning any pretense of cover. He was sprinting down a steep, narrow goat path directly toward the overhang where Murray was treating Romero. He had an AK 47 inches one hand and a fragmentation grenade in the other. Sophia tracked him. He was moving erratically, slipping on the loose stones, his center of gravity wildly unpredictable. She squeezed the trigger. Crack. The round shattered the rock 6 inches behind his heel. A miss. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her detachment. She had rushed the shot. The enemy fighter heard the impact, realized the angle of the sniper, and sprinted faster, abandoning his zigzag pattern in a desperate dash for the overhang. "Come on," she hissed through gritted teeth, cycling the bolt with violent, uncharacteristic force. She jammed the rifle back into her shoulder pocket. She didn't hold over. She aimed directly at his pelvis, a massive, unmoving center of gravity regardless of how fast his legs were pumping. Whump. The heavy magnum round obliterated his hip joint. He went down instantly, a tangled mass of limbs, tumbling down the goat path and coming to a rest 30 yards from the SEAL's position. The grenade rolled harmlessly from his open palm, detonating with a flat crump a safe distance away. Target 9 down. Time, 16:45. Target 10 was the commander, or, at least, the last man brave enough to try and salvage the ambush. He didn't run. He stepped out of the deepest shadow of the main cave, raising a pair of binoculars. He was looking directly at Sophia's rock shelf. He had triangulated the sound of her misses and the puffs of dust from her muzzle brake. Time slowed down to a thick, syrupy crawl. Sophia stared into the black, reflective lenses of his binoculars. He dropped them, raising his rifle to his shoulder. He was looking right at her. She felt the sweat drip off her nose and land on the stock of her rifle. The reticle rested perfectly between his collarbones. She didn't feel triumph. She just felt exhausted, hollowed out by the sheer, mechanical repetition of taking human life. Whump. The final round caught him in the throat. He didn't fall dramatically. He just sank to his knees, his hands reaching up to grasp at the sudden, catastrophic void in his neck before collapsing forward. Target 10 down. Time 18. Silence descended on the gorge. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, ringing with the phantom echoes of gunfire and the harsh, ragged sound of Sophia's own breathing. She lay perfectly still for 2 full minutes, her eye glued to the scope, scanning the shadows, waiting for an 11th target. Nothing moved. Getting down was infinitely worse than getting up. Her adrenaline crashed, leaving her limbs feeling like wet sand. She packed the MAC-22 back into the drag bag with shaking hands. She slid down the scree slope on her backside, the sharp shale tearing through her combat pants and slicing shallow cuts into her calves. She didn't care. She hit the bottom of the riverbed and staggered toward the overhang. Murray stood over Romero. Romero was pale, his lips blue, but the bleeding had stopped, replaced by a massive pressure bandage. Collins was kneeling near the perimeter, his rifle scanning the empty ridgeline. Murray turned as she approached. He looked at her covered in gray dust, her knees torn open, blood mixing with sweat on her face. Then he looked at the elongated, heavy drag bag slung across her back. He hadn't read her jacket. He hadn't known. "Brown," Murray said. His voice was hoarse. The icy perimeter, the condescending glances in the mess hall, the subtle dismissals, all of it had evaporated in the span of 18 minutes. There was no movie scene salute. There was only the raw, haunted stare of a man who realized he owed his life to the woman he had completely marginalized. How many? She unclipped her helmet, letting it drop into the dirt. The canyon air felt suddenly freezing against her wet scalp. 10, Chief, Sophia replied, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Nobody cheered. Nobody offered a handshake. They just sat in the stifling heat, breathing in the smell of cordite and burnt bleach, waiting for the medevac bird, bound together by a profound, unspeakable violence. Did this raw, gritty look into the reality of tactical combat keep you on the edge of your seat? Real stories of survival aren't born in Hollywood. They're forged in the dirt, sweat, and smoke of impossible situations. If you appreciated this unflinching dive into military suspense, drop a like, share it with someone who respects the untold grit of frontline operators, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, action-packed narratives every single week. Stay frosty.